first couple of chapters is just her giving us some color about what it was to grow up in Louisiana in the 90s. And she says that raising kids in the South used to be more about respecting your parents and keeping your mouth shut. Today, the rules have reversed. It's more about respecting the kids. Disagreeing with a parent was never permitted in my house. No matter how bad it got, there was an understanding to stay mute. And if I didn't, there were consequences. In the Bible, it says your tongue is your sword. My tongue and my sword were me singing. My whole childhood I sang. I sang along with the car radio on the way to dance class. I sang when I was sad. To me, singing was spiritual. I was born and I went to school in Macomb, Mississippi, and I lived in Kentwood, Louisiana, 25 miles away. Everyone knew everyone in Kentwood. Doors were left unlocked. Social lives revolved around church and backyard barbecues. Kids were put in matching outfits and everyone knew how to shoot a gun. The area's main historic site was Camp Moore, a Confederate training base built by Jefferson Davis. Each year there are Civil War reenactments the weekend before Thanksgiving, and the sight of the people dressed up in military outfits was a reminder that the holiday was coming. I loved that time of year. Hot chocolate, the smell of the fireplace in our living room, the colors of fall leaves on the ground. When I initially read this, being a person from the South myself, I have a little bit of a bone of contention whenever people start describing like the quintessential Southern town, because it always feels like we're performing for other people in the rest of the country who might not know what it is to be in the South, and sometimes feels like we are just like continually feeding the stereotype to Northerners and stuff like that. And so whenever somebody starts talking about my quintessential growing up years in the South, it's always like, okay, but really, I mean, is that really how it was? And so I kind of braced myself as I was starting this book. I was like, oh, Brittany, please don't do that thing where you talk about everybody knew everybody else, and we just, there was always some kind of a drama going on, and daddy did this and mama did that, and everybody knew everybody else. We're just the smallest town. Everybody went to church, but nobody loved Jesus. Like, I just couldn't even. So, but that's not how it really actually is. And so I should say that I feel like she is just honestly trying to give us a feel for like the normalcy of life in Louisiana, because it's going to get crazy later on in her life. And this was what felt safe. If you could say that there was safety in her childhood, it was this little town where there was not a whole lot going on, and there were friendships to be had, and sort of like the cyclical nature of the seasons brought some contentment, structure, and expectation in that sameness. And so I think that's all she's trying to do here. She said she describes her house as a little brick house with green striped wallpaper paneling. She went to a Christian school called Park Lane Academy. She said that her first time that she ever heard any music that really like gave her shivers was when she heard the housekeeper singing gospel music while she was doing laundry. And they sometimes had a housekeeper when times were good. The financial situation in this family is like a roller coaster. And she goes on to talk about it. But when times were good, they'd have a housekeeper. Other times, Britney was doing the laundry and the ironing. But this time, the housekeeper was there. And when she sang, Britney said that she got chills up and down her spine. And she knew that she wanted to be able to give other people the experience that she just had. She said, ever since then, my longing and passion to sing have grown. Singing is magic. When I sing, I own who I am. I can communicate purely. When you sing, you stop using the language of, hi, how are you? You're able to say things that are much more profound. Singing takes me to a mystical place where language doesn't matter anymore, where anything is possible. Oh, too bad she couldn't have sang that passage, just a little bit meager, but I know what she's saying. Music is weirdly spiritual. And it's also, it's like, if there was magic on earth, it would be music. Because how does music make you feel things? Like, you could be in a bad mood and put on a song and you're in a good mood. You could be in a good mood and put on a sad song and you suddenly feel down. How does music have the ability to manifest emotions like it does? So I completely understand her draw towards creating whatever that is. And she, especially if this was the way that she transcended the chaos in her house, I can completely see why she was so driven to pursue a musical career, because that is the way, even since like little bitty, she's found a way to slide out of the crazy and just sort of cocoon herself in. She says that she was really serious about her music even as a little kid, and nobody was doing the sort of thing she was doing. But what she liked to do was go to the backyard and she would shoot these silly music videos to Mariah Carey songs. And, by age 8, she says, I thought I was a director. Nobody in my town can be doing stuff like that. But I knew what I wanted to see in the world, and I tried to make it so. She says that the reason that she just needed to get away from everything was that her family's history, the foundation of the family, is just rooted in tragedy and trauma. And because of the traumatic upbringings of both of her parents and just the sadness in both of her parents' lives, they brought all that crap and put it in one house, and Britney was living in it. She talks about her father's mother, named Jean. She says, "My middle name comes from my father's mother, Emma Jean Spears, who went by Jean. I've seen pictures of her and I understand why everyone said that we look alike. Same blonde hair, same smile. She looked younger than she was." Her husband, my grandfather, June Spears Sr., was abusive. Jean suffered the loss of a baby when he was only 3 days old. June sent Jean to Southeast Louisiana Hospital, by all accounts, a horrible asylum in Mandeville, where she was put on lithium. In 1966, when she was 31, my grandmother, Jean, shot herself with a shotgun on her infant son's grave, just over 8 years after his death. I can't imagine the grief that she must have felt. Well, can you imagine, like, her father, like, that is the backdrop of his life. His mother committed suicide on the grave of his dead younger brother. And one of the reasons that she probably did it wasn't just from the grief of having lost the child, although obviously that would have been heavy, heavy weight to bear, but because the person she's walking beside in the grief is this guy named June, and he sounds like a freaking nightmare. Britney says the way people talk about men like June in the South is to say nothing was good enough for him, and that he was a perfectionist, and that he was a very involved father. But she says that I would have probably put it more harshly than that. Yeah, because when in the South they say he's a very involved father, what they mean is he won't get out of his kid's life and he is a monster and he's all up in their face all the time. She said that a sports fanatic, June made my father exercise long past exhaustion. Each day when my father finished basketball practice, no matter how tired and hungry he was, he still had to shoot 100 more baskets before he could come inside. June was an officer for the Baton Rouge Police Department, and he eventually had 10 children with 3 different wives. And, as far as I could tell, no one had a good word to say about him for the first 50 years of his life. Even in my family, it was said that the Spears men tended to be bad news, especially in terms of how they treated women. Jean wasn't the only wife that June sent to the mental hospital in Mandeville. He sent his second wife there too. One of my father's half-sisters has said that June sexually abused her starting when she was 11, and she ran away when she was 16. Now, her father was 13 when his mother committed suicide. And Britney says, I know that trauma is part of why my father was how he was with my siblings and me. Why, for him, nothing was ever good enough. My father pushed my brother to excel in sports. He drank until he couldn't think anymore. He disappeared for days at a time. When my father drank, he was extremely mean. But June, the grandfather who had abused 3 wives, sent 2 to the insane asylum, and possibly had sexually abused one of his daughters, apparently did soften in later years. Because Britney says that even though she heard all these terrible things about her grandfather, she had never experienced this vicious man who had abused her father and his siblings. And he was a really patient and sweet grandfather, as far as she knew. But that might have been how her grandfather did, but that's not how her dad did. He has not softened at all, at any point. And he sounds like a terrible person, honestly. Terrible, but like also the product of chaos. And unfortunately, he continued to turn to the bottle for help. I mean, are there better ways to deal with our pain than to drink? Obviously. But if a person is doing that to run away from something, and it's self-preservation, and so my heart, I'm sorry for him, but at the same time, there comes a point when it's like, okay, but it isn't just self-preservation anymore. You got to worry about how's it going for the pack of babies you got now. You know, it can't just be about like, how am I going to get through the day? It's how am I going to father this pack of kids and get them through the day as well. Now, to talk about her mother's people, she said that her grandmother was British and that her grandmother had sort of been hoodwinked into coming to Louisiana. She'd met this guy who was in the Navy, the grandfather, and they'd met at a dance or something. And they had gotten married, and the grandmother had come, her name's Lily. Lily had come from a very sophisticated family in England, and she was used to being around very well-educated people. They all played instruments and spoke other languages, and they were like very highbrow individuals. But she marries this guy from Louisiana. They come back to America, and she was disappointed when he brought her with him to America because she'd imagined a life like what she'd had in London. And as she rode to his dairy farm from New Orleans, she looked out the window of Barney's car, that's the grandfather, and was troubled by how empty his world seemed. "Where are all the lights?" she kept asking her new husband. Instead of going to the theater or shopping for clothes, she would have to spend her life cooped up in the country, cooking and cleaning and milking cows. So my grandmother kept to herself, read a ton of books, became obsessed with cleaning, and missed London until the day she died. My family said that Barney didn't want to let Lily go back to London because he thought that if she went, she wouldn't come home. What a poor, wretched life. Lily was so distracted in her own world that you'd be trying to eat a meal and she'd be like clearing the table before you're even done eating because she's just like always in her own head. So present, physically, completely out to lunch in her mind. And so that's the backdrop of Britney's mom's growing up experience, is having a mom who didn't want to be there at all and was constantly trying to create a fantasy world in her head so that she could just cope with how wretched her life seems to have turned out according to what she thought it was going to be. And you can see why Britney's mom just does not know how to parent at all, in any capacity, and why she's so overwhelmed, because she wasn't given any kind of education on how to be a present mother. But Britney says that all she knew was that her grandmother was beautiful and she loved copying her British accent. She wanted to have manners and a lilting voice just like her grandmother's. Because Lily had money, my mother Lynn, her brother Sonny, and her sister Sandra grew up with what you might consider money, especially for rural Louisiana. They attended Catholic school. She says her mother was gorgeous as a teenager with her black hair worn short. She'd always go to school wearing the highest boots and the tiniest skirts. She hung out with the gay guys in town who gave her rides on their motorcycles. That sounds like a riveting crew. A bunch of gay guys on bikes speeding down the main street in Louisiana. What crew was that? Interesting. She says my father took an interest in her, as well he might. And probably, in part, because June made him work so ridiculously hard, my father was unbelievably talented at sports. People would drive for miles just to see him play basketball. My mom saw him and said, "Oh, who is this?" By all accounts, the relationship was born of mutual attraction and a sense of adventure, but the honeymoon was over long before I came along. Chapter 2. So, her parents are married. They're young. Her mother's 21, her dad's 23. Her mother is no longer being supported by her wealthy family, and they've fallen on hard times. Lo and behold, who should come along but a baby Brian, that's the older brother. They don't have 2 pennies to put together. So, her mom goes to school to become a teacher. Her dad, who worked as a welder at oil refineries, started to drink heavily, and before too long, that was taking a toll on the family. I mean, you can imagine this young guy, he's had a horrifically tragic upbringing in the sense that his father's super abusive. His mom killed herself on the grave of his dead brother. And now he's a young thing. He's trying to support a family. He's got a new baby. I mean, what in the world is this guy supposed to do with himself? He's got no foundation with which to father this family. He hardly knows what to do with himself as far as how to bring in any kind of a living. I mean, he turned to the bottle, and he turned to it hard. She says, the way my mom tells it, a couple of years into the marriage, my grandfather Barney, my mom's dad, died in a car accident. And in the aftermath, my dad went on a bender, missing Brian's first birthday. When Brian was a toddler, my father got drunk at a Christmas party and went AWOL, and on Christmas morning, too. That time, my mother said that she'd had enough. She went to stay with Lily. That March of 1980, she filed for divorce. Then his family intervened and was like, please don't divorce him. He's trying his best. So she doesn't. For a while, apparently, everything was calm. My dad stopped welding and started a construction business. And then after a lot of struggle, he got a gym business going, too. It was called Total Fitness, and it transformed some of the men in town, including my uncles, into bodybuilders. He ran it in a detached studio space on our property next door to the house. An endless string of muscular men streamed in and out of the gym, flexing their muscles in the mirrors under the fluorescent lights. My dad started doing really well. In our little town, he became one of the most well-off men. My family threw big backyard crawfish boils. They had crazy parties with dancing all night long. I've always assumed their secret ingredient for staying up all night was speed, since that was the drug of choice back then. My mom opened a daycare center with her sister, my Aunt Sandra. To cement their marriage, my parents had a second baby, me. I was born on December 2nd, 1981. My mother never missed an opportunity to recall that she was in excruciating labor with me for 21 hours. She says that while she felt wary of the men in her life, as far as her dad, who was kind of a scary person, and the grandfather who she'd been sort of told stories about, She did love the women in her family. She loved her Aunt Sandra. She didn't have the opportunity to ever obviously know her grandmother, Jean, who had killed herself, but she got to know her great-grandmother, Lexi Pierce. She said Lexi was wicked beautiful, always made up with a white face and red lipstick. She was a badass more and more so as she got older. I was told, and had no trouble believing, that she'd been married 7 times. 7! Obviously, she disliked her son-in-law, June, but after her daughter, Jean, died, she stuck around and took care of my father and his siblings, and then her great-grandchildren, too. She and Lexi were super close, so she would go and spend the night. She would do makeup with Lexi. They would cook together. They would watch old movies together. They would even take naps together. It's just like very cozy and safe and normal with Lexi. But then a really sort of sad thing happened. Her grandmother was getting older, and one night they went to go and rent a video. And on the way back, her grandmother ran into another car and then got stuck in a hole, and they couldn't get the car out, and a tow truck had to come. And after that, Brittany's mom just put the kibosh on any time being spent with Lexi. Brittany's mom said, she's old, she's senile, we can't trust you with her, and we don't know what's going to happen if you hang out with her because she just can't manage herself anymore, so you don't go over there anymore. You know, you can still see her when she comes to our house, but you're not going to go spend the night over there anymore. You cannot be left alone with her. And that really made Brittany upset because she felt like the accident could have happened to anybody. It wasn't because Lexi was old. And that, for her, was the removal of one of the safest places she had known. And it didn't matter how much she begged, and it didn't matter how much she cried, nobody would listen to her. And, you know, so for her, it felt like her voice just didn't matter. If she was speaking, nobody cared what she was saying. If she was asking for something, nobody cared what it was. This is the way, this is how we do, and don't question it. All right, so those first 2 chapters are sort of just like bringing us up to speed about just generally how was life in small town Louisiana, you know, with a background of chaos. And, you know, she's sort of making her way through it with her little dancing and her singing and all this. But there's always this fear, always, anything could go off the rails at any time.